I'm just waiting for confirmation.
Okay, good evening. Glad to see you here, and I'm glad to see our speaker here. This is Maja Catic, who's going to give us a talk about genocide. I think it's something like the challenge of reconciling, I've forgotten the title, the need to forget and the need to remember, and the tension between those two needs. I think that's a very interesting thing. Maja Catic is, largely a Torontonian. She did her undergraduate degree at Scarborough and here too, and then a master's degree in Russian and Eastern European studies, and then went on to Brandeis University, where she did a PhD in political science. And over the years has developed quite a consuming interest in genocide and the politics and social life revolving around the history of genocide and the dynamics of remembering or forgetting genocides. So I'm pleased to be able to welcome her. So please come and give us a talk, Maya.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. And thank you, Maja, for having me here. Thanks for those of you who may be watching this from the comfort of your own homes. I do want to repeat the title because I think it's important in case that you're expecting a talk of on a particular genocide or on the actual dynamic of mass atrocities. The title of the talk is "The Politics of Genocide Recognition Between the Imperative to Remember and the Need to Forget." And I am
your mic a little bit. Pull it up a little more.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay. And I am primarily concerned in the politics of recognition, not particularly in adjudicating and debating whether particular cases constitute genocide or not, but certainly I can take questions on these issues as well.
Do it some more. Let's work on this sound. I'm not hearing you very well. Are you guys? Yeah, get a little closer or something. There.
Better? No, not yet.
What do you think?
It's not,
okay.
it's input.
I don't know whether we can do anything about the volume, but I want to make sure that we can hear.
Okay.
Yeah, he's going to turn up the volume.
All right. Okay. Okay, try it now, Maya.
Is this better?
Yes.
Much better.
Okay.
Much better.
Not deafening? Okay,
No,
excellent. So should I repeat the title again, just in case? The title of the talk is "The Politics of Genocide Recognition Between the Imperative to Remember and the Need to Forget." And again, I am concerned primarily with the politics of genocide recognition, not particularly with any case of mass atrocity as such, or adjudicating whether or not a particular case constitutes genocide, but I will certainly address if those questions come up in the Q&A. Over the past several decades, genocide recognition has gained prominence as a political project, both in domestic and international contexts. And just to give you an example of the two most long-standing, but certainly also most vocal and most visible initiatives in North America, that of the Armenian genocide recognition or the Ukrainian genocide recognition, other groups as diverse as the Bosnians, Greeks, Tamils, Sikhs, or the Circassians and the Tatars have been pursuing some form of genocide recognition, both in domestic contexts, but also in international fora. For the most part, the actors who pursue genocide recognition are communal organizations or political parties that represent particular ethno-national groups. But in the recent years, we have also seen states that pursue genocide recognition as part of their foreign policies. So, for example, in the case of Bosnia, in the 1990s, and certainly up to date, in the case of Armenia and Ukraine, genocide recognition has become part of their foreign policy. It has also been the states that are the targets of genocide recognition initiatives. So first and foremost are the states that are considered to be the perpetrator states that are responsible for certain instances of mass atrocities that groups want to see labeled as genocide, but also states that are deemed to be legal descendants. So for example, in the case of Turkey, for the Ottoman killings of the Armenians, or in the case of Russia, for example, for a wide range of mass atrocities, whether inside the Russian Empire throughout the 19th century, or for example, inside the Soviet Union for much of the 20th century. The non-state actors have also been engaged in this particular project, primarily because the groups that pursue genocide recognition seek recognition from non-state actors. So institutions such as the United Nations, for example, various European Union institutions, in the first order European Parliament, for example, but also non-state actors such as the Anti-Defamation League, for example, or International Association of Genocide Scholars. To give you some of the most recent examples, for those of you who do watch the news, several days ago or several weeks ago, there has been a diplomatic row that has exploded between the Netherlands and Turkey over the move in the Dutch parliament to recognize the 1915 killings of the Armenians as genocide, an act that has certainly angered Turkey. And in retaliation, Turkey has then accused the Dutch, certainly of their role in the Srebrenica genocide of 1995 in Bosnia. To bring this closer to home, last year, in April of 2017, the Ontario legislature became the first legislature the first body of this kind to officially recognize the 1984 killings of Sikhs in India as genocide. In the weeks following this recognition, it has created some diplomatic uncertainty, especially during the visit of the Canadian Defense Minister to India, when he was asked about this particular act. But most recently, as you can imagine, as more Sikh Canadians become prominent politicians in the Canadian context, not only in provincial context, but in the federal context, this is certainly something that I think we will be hearing more about. So despite the proliferation of genocide recognition initiatives in domestic contexts and in international contexts as well, the actual genocide recognition remains a bit of an understudied subject. First, it is because it's conceptually still very much underdeveloped. It lacks concept and theoretical clarity that can help us understand this better, but also because oftentimes genocide recognition is not examined critically in all of its complexity as a political project. So I wanted to take this opportunity in this talk to actually address these two particular issues. So I do want to start with providing some conceptual clarity, some ways for us to be on the same page as we talk about these issues. But also, I think the crux of my talk is really going to be the examination of motives. In other words, why are groups pursuing genocide recognition as a political project? So what motivates the groups to do so, which is the imperative to remember as alluded in the title. So let me begin by talking about the 3 W's of genocide recognition. In other words, who are the actors who pursue genocide recognition? Why do they do this? And what, in fact, constitutes genocide recognition? How can we think about it? So I will actually start with the what of recognition. When it comes to the what of recognition, in thinking about what constitutes recognition for a particular case of mass atrocity or mass starvation, for example, I want you to think about this in terms of 3 axes of recognition: juridical, political, and academic. So in terms of the juridical aspect of recognition, it's arguably very simple, because juridical recognition is the recognition that comes out of verdicts delivered in courts of law. So, for example, verdicts that came in the context of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for example, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Verdicts that come from the International Court or the International Court of Justice. Arguably, one could also look at Nuremberg, but it becomes a little bit more problematic. So in essence, the cases of mass death that have been prosecuted in the courts of law on the basis of the Genocide Convention, because this is the body of law that is used, or inside the domestic courts that have adapted the International Convention on Genocide, Such has been the cases in some of the Baltic states, for example, in the post-Soviet era. So those would be the cases that enjoy juridical recognition. Of course, you can perhaps imagine that this is quite problematic for the cases of genocide that have taken place before 1948, before the Genocide Convention came into effect. And the two cases that I mentioned as sort of the most long-standing and certainly the most dynamic, that of the Armenians and the Ukrainians, are certainly the cases that could potentially not enjoy juridical recognition because they have taken place before 1948, 1915, and on into the 1920s for the Armenian case, and the 1933, but mostly throughout the 1930s as well for the Ukrainian. In these particular contexts, the groups such as the Armenians and the Ukrainians, or rather the organizations that are affiliated with these groups, have actually come up with rather creative ways of dealing with this fact that it's not possible to apply the convention retroactively and to have tribunals that are based, for example, on the Nuremberg model or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So in 1984, a permanent People's Tribunal, for example, was called by a number of Armenian activists that engaged a number of very prominent jurists to essentially adjudicate whether or not the events of 1915 in the Ottoman Empire constitute genocide or not. And similarly, 4 years later, in 1988, a coincidence, Ukrainians have basically pushed for the establishment of a commission, of an independent international commission, again comprised of very prominent jurists, to again adjudicate in a process that very much resembles a legal procedural process that you could find inside, for example, tribunal or a court. And in both of these cases, for example, there were two sets of issues that those who were behind these initiatives were interested in. One was the applicability of the Genocide Convention, and the other one was to essentially ask these jurists that worked with the Permanent People's Tribunal on the one hand, or the commission for the Ukrainian case, to basically look whether the three constitutive elements of genocide were present in both of these cases. So to adjudicate whether there was intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, whether the actual constitutive elements of the destruction were present as outlined in the convention, and whether or not the groups that were targeted were the groups that were protected by the Genocide Convention, namely whether those groups were ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups. So in both of these cases, these two bodies essentially found that the cases of the Armenian killings of 1915 and the Ukrainian famine genocide, Holodomor of 1933, that both of these cases, in fact, do constitute a genocide. The other axis of recognition, I would argue, is the political recognition. So one way to think of the political recognition, and certainly from the perspective of the activists who push for genocide recognition, is to think about resolutions by relevant political bodies. So for the most part, resolutions have been initiated or sought from legislative bodies, such as the American Congress, for example, or the Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament, the French Parliament, the Russian Duma, you name it. Oftentimes it has been the executive, such as presidents or prime ministers. One of the, I think, difficulties with sort of reducing political recognition to simply resolutions or statements, regardless of their political weight or, for example, their diplomatic weight as well, is that these are largely discursive. So that the recognition that 1915 killings of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire by the American Congress, for example, would be considered something that is very important for the Armenian community nonetheless. But I think that the real political recognition is something that would push things forward. So let me give you an example. States that actually do recognize genocide would, as as a result of recognition by their political bodies, change their policy to reflect this fact of recognition. So, for example, they would change their alliance structures potentially. They would change their trade and investment patterns. They would change their curriculum inside their schools. They would make commemoration of these particular cases of genocide state policy. The latter two examples, for example, the curriculum change or the commemoration, is something that we have seen with respect to both the Armenian and Ukrainian cases, but the change in policy is something, of course, is that is something that's much more difficult. So again, to just give you a couple of examples, Turkey is often in the news because of the importance that it places on the international efforts to have the Armenian atrocities recognized as genocide. And oftentimes, the recognition in parliaments or statements by politicians anger the Turkish government, and often end in political or diplomatic rows that I talked about with respect to the one very recently. But for the most part, not much comes in concrete terms. In other words, despite the fact that states threaten to either cut the relationships in trade, for example, or investment, or because of the fact that, for example, Turkey threatens to retaliate on the basis of such recognition, very little happens because I would argue the costs of doing so are actually very great. Let me just give you three examples of the recognition that the Canadian state recognizes. So I will not talk about the Indigenous Genocide because it is the one of the cases that certainly enjoys recognition by the Canadian state. And I will not talk about it deliberately because it had taken place in Canada, and I think it's not very controversial for the Canadians. But Canada also recognizes Armenian famine genocide as genocide. It's a recognition that came not that long ago. It also recognizes the Armenian genocide and also recognizes the Srebrenica genocide, that is the 1995 Srebrenica genocide of the Bosnian War. My argument would be that for the regardless of what this represents for the groups that have been pushing for genocide recognition, and certainly regardless of what those MPs, for example, or even the prime ministers who have been at the helm of the state when these things happen, suggest, the recognition has only benefited overall Canadians or Canada, and there have not been great cost to these kinds of recognition, largely because Canada's relationship with Russia, for example, which certainly was angered when Canada recognized the Ukrainian famine genocide, or with Turkey when Canada recognized the Armenian genocide. The bilateral relationships between Canada and Russia on the one hand and Canada and Turkey on the other hand is not so great, so that there was no great threat to Canadian trade with any of these states. The defense relationship, for example, with Russia is non-existent, and whatever happens in the area of defense is something that is done through NATO. Similarly, with respect to Turkey, Canada is an ally of Turkey through NATO, and any kind of political disagreements or crises, again, in the defense sector is something that's mediated through NATO or through the United States. For example, Turkey often threatens, and sometimes actually does well on its promise, to deny access to NATO bases inside Turkey to states that recognize the Armenian genocide, including, for example, Canada or the United States. The third axis of recognition is the academic recognition, and for the most part, this is how the recognition initiatives usually start and how they're carried through. The 1970s and the 1980s, in fact, have seen a proliferation of programs inside universities and certainly of research and academic output when it comes to cases of genocide other than the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is something that has started academically in terms of research and teaching in North American and Western context a decade or so earlier. So the 1980s were critical, for example, for the Ukrainian, for the Armenian diaspora, investment, financial investment in particular into the research that would support the genocide recognition initiatives have been key. And they have certainly borne great results because despite, in the Armenian case in particular, despite very organized efforts by the government in Ankara, for example, to deny the genocide, for the most part, the case is settled academically. Very few academics still engage in debates that would deny the genocide. So the academic aspect of recognition is something that many of these groups focus on. And for the most part, it's actually all three axes that are important, and all three axes that these the agents of recognition actually focus on simultaneously. So a few words about the actors who pursue genocide recognition. So as I alluded in the beginning, it's generally, it's certainly ethno-national groups that work through the communal organizations. For the most part, and often for very obvious reasons, because the groups live in exile, it is the diasporic institutions, as was the case with the Armenians and the Ukrainians. But again, in both of these cases, for instance, in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union and the establishment of independent states in Armenia and Ukraine, the efforts have certainly been picked up, often very controversially, but nonetheless picked up by state institutions, so that in both Armenia and Ukraine, for instance, I also mentioned the case of Bosnia, where the situation is even more complicated, but nonetheless, it has become part of both domestic politics and certainly foreign policy of these states. So the agents of recognition are these actors that pursue genocide recognition, whether they're state actors or not, oftentimes, as I said, diasporic groups, parties, or associations. But the targets of recognition, again, are for the most part other states. First and foremost, the states that are considered to be responsible for genocide, whether on the account of the actual responsibility or on the account of the fact that they are juridical descendants of states that have committed atrocities in the past. But the other states have also been targeted for recognition. So, for example, the United States is inevitably a state from which groups seek recognition, and that is largely because of the power status of the United States being the superpower that wields incredible political and as well as diplomatic power. Obtaining recognition from the United States is considered to be quite valuable because it could ultimately lead to the recognition, so the argument goes, by the actual perpetrator state. Interestingly enough, there is another state that is often targeted for genocide recognition, or a state from which recognition is sought, and that state is Israel. One of the, I think, primary reasons for this is the fact that Israel enjoys particular moral standing as the state that has been founded by the victims of the Holocaust. And so enjoying the recognition by Israel is considered, again, to be quite valuable. Both the Ukrainians and the Armenians have unsuccessfully asked or sought that Israel recognizes their respective cases of genocide. I come now to, I think, what is the most interesting question, which is the question of why. So why are groups pursuing genocide recognition as a political project? So the groups themselves, the actors who pursue genocide recognition, usually cite four sets of reasons. One of them is uncontroversial. It's healing survivors, whether it's individuals or collectivities, so groups. The argument certainly being is that the recognition is something that will heal, it will help heal the trauma that is associated with mass atrocities, with genocide. The other set of factors that is often cited is the safeguarding the memory of victims, again, fairly uncontroversial. The third set of factors that is cited is rectifying injustices through some form of compensation. And certainly this is something that I will spend more time talking about very soon. But for the most part, when groups talk about rectifying injustices and obtaining some form of compensation, they essentially talk about two things: financial. So obtaining financial compensation for the for properties, whether they're individual properties of any sort or communal properties. But oftentimes, compensation includes the actual land and territory, and I'll talk about this in more detail, so I will leave it for now. And finally, the fourth set of motives that those who pursue genocide recognition cite is one, again, that's fairly uncontroversial. It's preventing future genocide. So the argument goes that recognizing historical injustices, recognizing past genocides, will help in the project of prevention. I'm very skeptical about this, and I would be really interested to find out what the audience thinks about it. But this is a very important, it's a very compelling argument, so that recognition of past genocides is helpful because it leads to, well, it helps in the prevention of future genocide. Now, while taking these four sets of motives that again come from those who pursue genocide recognition as a political project, I do want to argue that genocide recognition is actually best understood with respect to two distinct but interrelated phenomenon. One is the collective identity construction of the actual group that is behind the genocide recognition initiatives, and the other one is with respect to the inter-ethnic dynamic or the intergroup dynamic and intergroup relationships. Very briefly, regarding collective identity construction, I actually want to call on our very own Charles Taylor and his very prominent arguments in his essay called The Politics of Recognition. Taylor has argued that a number of strands in contemporary politics, whether in Canada or elsewhere, actually turns on the need and or the demand for recognition. The demand for recognition, according to him, is given urgency by the link between recognition and identity, where this latter term designates something like the person's or the collectivity's understanding of who they are, of their fundamental defining characteristics as human beings or human collectivities. To quote from Taylor, the thesis is that our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others, and so a person or a group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm and can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false or reduced mode of being. So in the context of the groups that have actually suffered very grave historical injustices, that have been victims of atrocity crimes and genocide, it's certainly not difficult to appreciate the relationship between identity and recognition. Related to this argument, of course, is also the argument that comes from the field of psychology or even psychiatry, and it relates to the intergenerational transmission of trauma. So part of the argument, again, goes to the fact that the recognition is actually very important because it helps survivors, but not only survivors, it also helps future generations deal with trauma because it helps resolve the mourning, the collective mourning that comes in the aftermath of these historical injustices. Finally, a significant body of literature that I turn to understanding this is that literature on interethnic conflict. And not only conflict as such, but the actual intercommunal violence and war. And here, what the literature tells us is that narratives of victimization play a very important role in the interethnic conflict. As scholars such as, for example, Leah Brillmeyer and Donald Horowitz remind us, claims that nationalists typically make have to do more with the moral standing of their claims than with the actual fact of nationhood. So let me just give you an example. In a number of contexts, be it Bosnia, for example, where you have three ethno-national groups competing for political resources and territory, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where you have two groups competing over territory, or conflict in Sri Lanka, for example. All of these three groups are ethno-national groups. They're nations, and despite the fact that one would often deny that the other one is a nation, or these kinds of arguments that are marshaled, the fact is that they are all national groups, and the fact of nationhood is something that they all share. So the argument that is often made by the nationalists is that Group A, my group, gets to get that territory, or it gets to remake the state in its own image because my group, unlike yours, suffered a historical injustice which we labeled genocide. And I will give you some more concrete examples of this. So in this particular context, ethno-national groups have increasingly used these genocide claims and the politics of recognition for the purpose of achieving political goals. So, for example, groups that control geopolitically vulnerable states, they've used genocide claims to counter the geopolitical and cultural hegemony of their bigger neighbors or regional powers. Some of the examples include the Baltic states, such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as Ukraine and a number of states in the Caucasus vis-a-vis Russia, for instance. Groups have also used genocide recognition claims to counter irredentist and secessionist threats to their territorial integrity. So states, for example, like Azerbaijan, with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh and its conflict with the Armenian minority, and Georgia, for example, again, with respect to its secessionist minorities in Abkhazia and Ossetia, have used the same argument. Groups have used it to legitimize territorial expansion and occupation, as is the case with Israel. In a similar fashion, groups aspiring to control the state, to control the institutions of the state in the context of multinational states. Think about Bosnia, for example, or Rwanda. The groups that have sought to control state institutions and remake them on the basis of their own values and interests, as well as their own identities, have used this argument to essentially marshal claims that are opposed by their competing groups. So, for example, the Bosniak elites in Bosnia or the Tutsi elites in Rwanda have used the so-called genocide argument to suggest that the state that came out in the post-conflict era has to assume a particular shape, that institutions have to be of a particular kind because their groups have suffered genocide and the other group has not. And so it becomes a form of restorative justice in a way. Furthermore, secessionist groups have also used genocide claims to delegitimize host states by emphasizing the political impossibility of living in a state that has perpetrated genocide against their group, and for framing their secessionist claims and claims for independence. So, for example, you can think about the Kosovo Albanians in their struggle for independence from Serbia, for instance, as well as the case of Abkhazia and Ossetia, who still refuse to become part or to become reintegrated into the Georgian state, and who struggle for their independence for Georgia. And finally, genocide recognition plays a very important role with respect to identity construction of diasporic groups. For instance, diasporic groups experience pressures of acculturation over years and assimilation, and these memories of tragic victimhood reinforce what is perceived to be their very fragile and threatened identities. So, for example, as Peter Novick has argued in the case of the Holocaust, Holocaust has become the virtually only denominator of U.S. Jewish identity in the late 20th century, and similarly, the reconstructed memories of the Armenian genocide on the one hand, or the Ukrainian Holodomor on the other, can be seen as identity markers for the groups which are increasingly assimilated into their host states. So that was about the imperative to remember. Now, what about the need to forget? I think that for the most part, the need to forget is something that has become quite controversial. I mean, the very possibility of forgetting something as horrific is often considered to be simply just, it's not even considered. And part of this has to do with denial, often very active denial, by entities, including state entities. So I just want to end with the possibility of forgetting, or rather why, for example, the possibility, or whatever that possibility may mean, we can certainly discuss that, why that is something that we should consider in this particular discussion. In their book titled Denying History, Who Says the Holocaust Never Happened and Why Do They Say It?, the authors Michael Shermer and Alex Groban argue that Holocaust denial, if unchecked, could distort other historic events. And so similarly, what is at stake, for example, after about more than a century now, after the events which led to the Armenian annihilation from their Anatolian homeland, is the precedent that these kinds of events create for distorting other historical events, especially in the hands of the powerful against the less powerful groups. So I want here to quote Kundera's prophetic words, namely that the struggle of men against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And this is certainly something I think that groups that engage in genocide recognition have taken to heart. So it is certainly that in this context of this struggle of memory against forgetting that we need to see genocide recognition efforts. So it's a struggle to affirm the suffering and the victimization, and certainly to honor the victims. But the struggle of memory against forgetting can itself present a danger to the collective identity of the victimized group, and of course to the democratic processes and the functioning of their states. No one has better understood this danger than the Israeli intellectual historian Yehuda Elkanah, who observed long ago in the 1980s that the memory of the Holocaust systematically and forcefully penetrated the Israelis' public consciousness, and he argued with disastrous consequences. Arguing that Israel's Holocaust memory adversely affected Israel's relationship with the Palestinians and placed Israel's democracy in a precarious position, Elkanah called on the Israeli society to uproot the domination of the historical remember over their lives. In fact, it was his words, his phrases, the need to forget, in an article that was published in Haaretz in 1988. As he eloquently put it in that article, the very existence of democracy is endangered when the memory of the dead participates actively in the democratic process. And similarly, another historian, Ian Buruma, has argued that the danger with centering collective identities on historic victimization and the dominance of the imperative to remember historical victimhood is dangerous for the politics because it essentially threatens to displace the political for the sake of the rhetoric of healing. So for many groups, then, finding the balance really is the challenge, even though I think that for the most part, it is the imperative to remember that takes precedence, and that the possibility that the group would even want to forget is denied and not discussed. So I will leave it at this.
Okay, questions?
Of course, yes, sir.
I'm sorry for being so elementary, but would you be kind enough to define what genocide is and distinguish it from civil war and, say, conquest, just for the sake of discussion?
Okay. Many definitions of genocide. I think the one that I would recommend using, and I think that the one that, for the most part, these groups themselves are very intent on using is the definition that comes out of the Genocide Convention. And so according to the Genocide Convention, then there are three elements to genocide. One is that there are four types of protected groups. So national groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, and religious groups are the groups that are protected by the Genocide Convention. In the lead up to the actual formulation of the convention, there were discussions in terms of including other groups that were not culturally defined. So including political groups. You can imagine this is 1948, so leading up, the possibility of including political groups is not something that the Soviets necessarily liked. So a number of these groups were excluded. So for a genocide to occur, or rather for a case of mass atrocities, whether it happened in war or peace, right? A group that's targeted has to be one of these four. The other element that needs to be present is the intent to destroy, and the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. So just to sort of put it in perspective, the number of 6 million is something that has come up from the Holocaust. So we're dealing with the high end, 6 million. But the case of the Srebrenica massacres in 1995 at the end of the Bosnian War is also recognized as genocide first first by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And then this decision to label it genocide, or rather to rule that this was genocide, was also upheld by the International Court of Justice in its ruling. And that number, the number of victims is 7,000. Now, arguably, you could take the Bosnian Civil War as a whole and look at the Bosnian Muslims as the targeted group. And in that context, I think the number would be about 70,000. So 70,000, 6 million. But again, it's the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. And that is probably the most problematic one, both in terms of evidence. But again, that's something, for the lawyers to discuss. And the third element are the acts that comprise genocidal destruction. The convention is very specific. I think there are about 7, but certainly the actual killing of the members of the group, the removal of children from the group. So, for example, in the case of Canada, what we had with the residential schools, for instance, or during the Franco years in Spain, denying the conditions of life, so starvation, forced starvation, hence the Ukrainian claim about the famine genocide is the one where, and this was a difficult one, but arguably, the argument is that the conditions for famine were created by political decision makers in Moscow because of the threat they thought the Ukrainian nation represented. So the 3 elements of genocide. In law, of course, the one category of crimes that comes close is the crimes against humanity. But it's of course, what distinguishes it is the protected group, for example. So that the actual intentional targeting of these 4 categories would comprise genocide. You talked about conquest and civil war. There's absolutely, genocides have happened for the most part in the context of war. In fact, they sort of go hand in hand. And perhaps the best way to prevent genocide is to prevent a war from occurring. They have happened in peacetime. They have happened during conquest. They have happened in various political contexts. So in authoritarian states, less authoritarian states, even in democratic states, if we consider Canada, the Dominion, and the United States, certainly Australia, they have happened in various, cultural contexts. So the Muslims have been both victims and perpetrators, and the Christians and the Buddhists and so on. So it's not related to any particular, I think, cultural or political context, although, of course, some regimes are more likely to perpetrate genocidal killings than others.
Killing is really one of the fundamental and crucial attributes. Is that not correct? Killing either in the sense of removing children and killing in the next generation, or physically setting out to eliminate the population.
Well, I think that one could certainly make an argument that, and for this I will go to the debates that Raphael Lemkin, the father of the convention, right, had in his own work as a historian, that you could have a genocide, according to Lemkin, and some people who would support this argument, without actual killing, because what's at stake are the features of a particular group. So that the genocide against indigenous peoples, for example, because they have occurred over a long period of time and they have not, for the most part, involved killing on large scale. But I think we are now at a point where it's accepted that certainly it is genocide for all, because it qualifies under all other characteristics, so that the removal of children the complete annihilation, well, the creation of conditions of life, so the annihilation of the animals that supported not only their biological, physical life, but certainly their culture. I think one quote that comes to mind, in the context of the United States and the Indigenous Genocide in the United States, it was the United States Army that played an important role in terms of the removal of tribes, and certainly the attempts to, first integrate them, and then when that didn't work, then to remove them. But I cannot unfortunately recall the name, but the term was that it was desirable to not, to kill the Indian, not the man. It was just cheaper. So killing an Indian meant that you killed an Indian. Culturally, you still did not kill a person. You didn't remove him from the face of the earth. But that in itself certainly is genocide. So not the actual physical annihilation and the killing of bodies, but killing an Indian, not the man, or killing the Jew, not the man, even though of course there are different, but that would be the essence. So you could, in that respect, despite the fact that for the most part, yes, it involves the actual killing, oftentimes in unimaginable ways, but it's not a precondition. Yes.
Did your research have a lot in terms of when we talk about Latin America? We sometimes, this may fall outside of the genocide realm, but are there parallels that you drew from victims of extrajudicial killings and that sort? And what is their voice compared to those compared to genocide?
So
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the cases of extrajudicial killing, I'm assuming in dictatorial and right. So Argentina, for example, would that be a case? Yeah. Okay. Well, in the last 2 decades, well, certainly I can talk about the last decade because I have been at conferences and I've talked to scholars in Argentina. Argentina is a very interesting case because there has been a lot of research, and very deliberately there has been a lot of research and attempts to certainly place Argentina comparatively. So to look at it other cases. Now, it best compares with other cases in Latin America, but certainly there are comparisons with other cases. So Argentina is actually a very good example, in part because, so for example, one of the categories that I mentioned, the removal of children. I mean, this is something that was certainly done in Argentina. So that we know, is it the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo or the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo? So the removal of children of leftists. This was something, and it was not just the removal of children of leftists from their families after their parents were usually dropped into the ocean from army helicopters, but it was also the placement of these children with the right families, and those would be right-wing, usually military families. Again, parallel here would be with Franco's Spain, for example. One of the difficulties, and I think this is where the research is happening right now, is while the actual acts are certainly compare with other cases of genocide, the problem is, so what's the targeted group? And so if we look only at the convention, and the scholars don't look only at the convention. I mean, the scholars, whether they're historians, political scientists, sociologists, have come up with a wide range of definitions. I cite the convention because it's the one that's most often cited, and certainly the one that mostly defines this. But the difficulty in Argentina and some of the similar cases in Latin America is, but not all, and I'll mention some which are exceptional, is that, so who is the targeted group? So if the targeted group in Argentina during the junta are the leftists or the socialists or whatever, it's politically defined. So, and that is not a group that is in the convention. So then part of the challenge then becomes, well, do we define, do we work towards expanding the definition, and what are then the implications? So just sort of in terms of the politics of it, the ethno-national groups don't like that because, it sort of waters it down in a way. That's one of the arguments. But you did have cases in Latin America where it was actually unequivocally genocide.
Central America.
Yes, Guatemala, for example. And I think that, some of the cases where the targeting was especially of the indigenous population, I mean, there's always overlap. I mean, it's the leftists, indigenous leaders, and by definition, or sort of by extension, their tribes or their groups or but there were cases in Latin America certainly where it was the Mayans in Guatemala, for example, where and there were trials. I think for Guatemala specifically, for this particular, but for the other cases of dictatorial right-wing militarist regimes, the difficulty is defining the targeted group, or rather the protected group. I mean, does it fit with the Genocide Convention? And then, depending on the answer, how do we go about that? Okay.
There's a few questions
Sure.
from online.
Oh, okay. So are we doing that, and then in the back?
Well, we can go back and forth between
Sure.
live audience and
Okay.
online. The first online question is, they say you're currently serving on the advisory council of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. What is your exact role?
I'm not. That was a mistake. So that was in the past. So it was.
Yeah.
So it was on the advisory council.
Okay, we can move to the next
Yes,
question. This one comes from Luke. What strategic steps can be taken to intervene in conflicts and prevent further escalation, such as genocide?
Should I repeat the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So the question is, what strategic steps can be taken to intervene in conflicts and prevent genocide? I'm very skeptical about genocide prevention, and I think in part is because I think that the notion of never again has not worked so far, and so I'm just not. I don't think it will work in the future. But I mentioned something earlier, namely that genocide, for the most part, happens during wars, and I mean, war radicalizes groups. It radicalizes. It just creates conditions where genocides are much more likely. I mean, you can think about the Middle East today. Since the invasion of Iraq. I mean, you can think about all the cases of genocide. You think about the Holocaust. It happens in the context of World War II. Think about the Armenian case. Happens during World War I. You can think about the context of the Iraq-Iran war and what happens, and then Lebanese war, Bosnian war. I mean, all of these things. So again, for the most part, no war, no genocide. The longer the wars go on, I mean, the possibilities of genocidal killings are certainly increasing. And again, I want to, turn to the Middle East because we can see the escalation of conflict and the ever widening pool of groups targeted for genocide by a wide range of other groups, whether it's ISIS or the regime in Syria or the militias in Iraq, you name it. So no war, no genocide. Yes.
Has there been any effort on the part of the victims I'm thinking of 3 cases in particular. I'm wondering whether these victims there's been any effort on the part of the victims to have their situations recognized as genocide. One is Darfur. The other one that comes to mind particularly for me is the Rohingya. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Yazidi religious minority in the Middle East. So would you know whether there's been any effort on the part of any of these groups to have their, their, let's say, it's not the best term, but their treatment recognized as genocide? And I'll leave it at that.
Sure. So for all of these are very recent. In fact, I think with respect to Rohingya Muslims, it's an ongoing case. And let me start with that one. Because of the actual group being victimized as we speak, so the attempts have been made by the outsiders. I mean, essentially, you have seen efforts outside of the region, calling in particularly on the leader of Burma, to intervene. With respect to the Yazidis, again, there was a lot of attention paid to the Yazidis in particular. I think sometimes at the expense of other groups, but certainly the labeling is important. Even in it's actually primarily important in the context of the actual genocide, because if you can label it, if you can get the actors to agree that it is genocide, then there is an imperative to actually intervene. I mean, there is a legal obligation to intervene. And this is, if you think back to Rwanda, for example, this is why both the American administration, but certainly the UN, the various UN actors, did everything possible to avoid using the word, because nobody wanted to intervene. I mean, I think Maria Dallaire was the one who used the word, but pretty much everybody in the American administration and United, and we have documents and memos from within the UN of this effort to actually not use the word, because then there is no obligation to intervene. But certainly the groups that are victims want the label to be used, because there is an international obligation to intervene by states. And certainly by the United Nations. With Darfur, I'm much less familiar with that particular case. I mean, I do know that the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and certainly many scholars, have drawn attention. Oftentimes, the initiatives to get genocide recognition are something that hinges upon resources that groups have at their disposal. And so, for example, it can be as simple as, let me just give you one that has been very small but has grown over the years, the case of Bangladesh. So with respect to the early 1970s war in East Pakistan, what would later become Bangladesh. So for many years, I think most people in the West did not know what transpired there, but not maybe in the last 15 years, I want to say, there has been a small community, especially around Keene University in the United States, for example. And so once groups are in diaspora, once they can actually tap into whether it's academic resources, but certainly, in the context of North American, in the context of US and Canadian politics, I mean, there are associations and things in place that could actually make that easier. But certainly with respect to the Yazidis, I think there were hearings in the American Congress as the killings were ongoing, to basically and bringing the Yazidi survivors to give testimony, again in an effort here not simply to recognize but to actually get them to intervene to stop the killings. Okay, you, sir, and then you, and then I'll give you. Okay.
Further to the question of what can be done to prevent, in a context outside of war, people who are activists around mining and destruction of Aboriginal cultures in different parts of the world have often talked about the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. Strengthening those kinds of conventions or bodies might be an approach. Again, getting the right wording in.
Well, again, I mean, I think.
Can you repeat the question?
Of course. So, in addition to stopping war, if that's the context in which genocide occurs, but you're absolutely right. So, genocides can occur, or processes. I mean, genocidal processes, because it's ultimately a continuum that we're talking about. So, they can occur in peacetime. And they can occur in states that are not embroiled in an international conflict, or certainly not in a civil war. So in some instances in Latin America in particular, but I mean, arguably one could, still talk about Canada, right? So what can be done if the context is not that of war? What can be done, for example, to advance Indigenous rights, especially in the ways that mining affects Indigenous cultures because of territories and access to land and resources. So the suggestion was that the conventions, the United Nations conventions on the rights of the Indigenous people is a tool that can be used. Absolutely, but I mean, I think that even if you consider that it has taken such a long time for a state like Canada, which actually has a lot of resources to essentially engage in restorative justice, right? I mean, you can imagine what it can be like in states that actually do not, well, first of all, they do not have the political system that would allow for something like that to be debated in the parliament, for politicians to be called to act. But certainly in terms of resources, I mean, many of the Latin American states would not have the resources to consider something like that. So personally, I mean, I do think that it is certainly desirable and possible. I'm just not sure that ultimately it is something that will save, many of the smaller groups, especially in Latin America, because of the double whammy. On the one hand, their own regimes, right, which are authoritarian and not particularly caring, but also the power of the corporations, the multinational corporations that operate in these contexts without the legal protections for the indigenous populations. Okay. Go ahead, please. Yes.
I have a number of things to say, but I'll limit myself. I think we've all noticed that, I'm going to quote Conor Cruise O'Brien. He said, "Oppressed peoples have a sense of their own virtue, which is in direct proportion to the magnitude of the crimes they have been powerless to commit." And we can all think of nations, groups who, having been victims, do not recognize that they themselves are victimizers. Of course, you know who I'm thinking of. When I was in Israel, we had a presentation from a woman from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And she said she does not use the word genocide to describe what's going on now. She said, "I am waiting until it actually starts." And I'm curious to know, I think I can guess, but why did Israel refuse to recognize genocides in other countries?
Why does Israel refuse to genocide in other countries? So let me just, for example, the Armenian case or the Ukrainian case. Okay. Well, very complex questions. Let me start with the Armenian one. I think that, well, first of all, actually, I think that when it comes to genocide recognition of other cases, right, I think there's something to be said about this thing that is known as sort of the uniqueness thesis, right, that only the Holocaust is the true genocide and nothing else compares, and therefore by extending the recognition to other cases, you sort of take away from what I think one official Israeli position or those who subscribe to that position would defend. So I think there's something to that. Although, of course, I think over the past several decades, there's been an impressive movement away from that, not only in Israel itself, but you can imagine that, for example, within the field of Holocaust studies, because essentially it started as the field of Holocaust or Holocaust and genocide studies. Initially, even among some of the scholars, there's been resistance to including other cases. And I think as a field, it has come a long way. But I think there are much more important and much more practical reasons. So with respect to the Armenian case, it really does have to do with regional politics, and it has to do with Israel's relationship with Turkey. And so regardless of, for example, what I think is a blip in Israel-Turkish relations under the Justice and Development Party because of all the rhetoric that the current Turkish government has in terms of how much it cares for the Palestinians and what it's prepared to do to, help the Palestinian cause. Regardless of all of that, there are some continuities in the bilateral defense relationships, and Israel is very dependent on its relationship with Turkey, and Turkey considers, it has been an enduring alliance. And so that, I think, is the primary reason why, for example, with respect to the Armenian case, although, of course, again, sort of going back to the politics of it all, every now and then, some of the members of the Knesset would threaten that they would recognize the Armenian genocide, and that usually happens if they're angered by some moves by Turkey. Now, the Ukrainian case is actually much more complicated, and it's much more complicated simply because the relationship between, let's say, the Jews in general and the Ukrainians, so not just the Israelis, right, but is a historic one that is very different from the relationship between the Armenians and the state of Israel, right? So that in the context of some of the narratives surrounding the Ukrainian famine genocide, for example, especially in the earlier days, the argument used to be that it wasn't simply the Soviet leadership that decided to annihilate Ukrainians as a nation because of the threat it represented to the building of the Soviet state and the Soviet nationhood. It is also that it was Jewish communists, in particular Lazar Kaganovich, for example. They would name people who they thought were actually responsible. So people who gave the orders to close off the borders, for example, or requisition grain to a point of creating starvation. And so there was a dose of anti-Semitism that is still very much there. And so it's very difficult, I think, for officials in Israel then to look at this case with, a clear head and to sort of see it on its own merits because, again, of these narratives that continue, I think, to poison some of these efforts. So that much for these two, I think, cases, because it was in these particular cases that they sought Israel to recognize. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, as I understand Dallaire's position, he was actually there, and he was there with a military force, but he could never get instructions to intervene. And when asked why he didn't get those instructions, my understanding was that he really attributed it to a kind of indifference in the UN, just a bunch of African tribal types going at each other. Why the hell should we bother type thing. That's really the way he put it. But he, in terms of long-term prevention, he felt that a military presence was doable. It's been there in the form of peacekeepers. He simply wanted to ratchet up their authority by giving them weapons and giving them the authority to use those weapons in order to enforce the peace. And he felt that that was really the change that could make a big difference. Now, you're not going to do it between Russia and the United States, but you might succeed in a smaller collection of countries where genocide is taking place for essentially political reasons.
Well, the Rwandan case is, I'll just briefly comment on your comment. The Rwandan case is certainly a complex one, right? And I think you're right about Dallaire's, assessment why there was, so it was presented for the most part as, a tribal, not just a tribal, an African tribal squabble, right? And so there were studies that were done in the aftermath, certainly, that looked into, the extent to which racism actually played a role. Because, and again, remember, this is 1994. So the Rwandan killings start in April of 1994. The actual annihilation happens very, very quickly, with incredible speed. And 1994 is sort of the midst of the Bosnian War, in which many of the other great powers are already engaged in and sort of trying to. The Rwandan War also came after the American fiasco in Somalia. So on the American side, that is something that has been, very, very important in their decision making. Alan Cooperman, his scholar, has actually worked on the Rwandan case, and one of his arguments that is certainly not the argument, if anything, I think Dallaire is probably very appalled by this argument, but it's certainly an argument that has been presented by Cooperman and supported by others, is that because of a couple of factors, including the speed at which it unfolded, but also simply the geopolitics of where the Great Lakes and the fact that the rapid reaction force would not it just would not be feasible. That this is one of the, this is why it just happened so quickly, because getting even the decision that was favorable to what Dallaire was asking would be very difficult to implement simply because of logistics. So that's Cooperman's argument. But then again, I mean, I sort of want to go back to the earlier, with Rwanda too, let's not forget is that you actually have a regional war that's raging at the time. So the genocide doesn't just happen in April of 1994. There are ways, and perhaps again, thinking in terms of prevention, what were these moments in the Rwandan case where intervention, certainly before even the deployment of the peacekeepers, where intervention would have actually been effective in preventing the killings. Sure.
Do you have a website that someone could follow you for blog posts or updates otherwise?
No. Sorry.
No.
Yes, please.
In other literature, is genocide looked at by the philosophers as an evidence of or an argument for human nature being evil? And so there's other literature that they intersect in any way, or is that examined, in that sense? And then I have a second question, which is different. Have you heard about the argument that some groups don't want to focus on their own victimization because it's not good for their well-being?
I'll start with that one. So I'll repeat this. So are there groups that actually do not focus on their victimization because it's not good for their well-being? So let me just give you a couple of. So at the same time, the Ukrainian famine occurred in 1933. There was a much wider famine actually that affected the Soviet Union at that time. So it wasn't just in what is today's Ukraine. It actually stretched to a couple of other regions inside the Soviet Union, a region called the Kuban in Russia, which is contiguous to Ukraine, but it's in today's Russia. It also affected Kazakhstan and perhaps some other regions inside the Soviet Union. And yet we do not know of, I don't know, maybe in the future we will, but the Kazakhs have not mobilized around, say, their famine. I'm trying to think about some of the other cases. I just can't. But this is the one that I think is instructive because it actually happened at around the same time, and in fact, it happened for the exact same reason. I mean, there was a famine that was arguably in part a famine that occurred in part because of the actual sort of natural conditions, but also because of very poor planning and a couple of other things. And then, of course, that was used by the regime to sort of deal with the Ukrainian nationalists. The argument that I want to make here is that, there is a dog that barked and the dog that didn't bark. And so we know that in Kazakhstan, the dog didn't bark, but, there are perhaps dogs that didn't bark that we don't know of. And I'm suggesting that, this argument is that the fact of victimization does not automatically translate into the glorification of victimhood or even into sort of these kinds of active recognition initiatives. They become political projects because of political decisions. There's no question that that these kinds of events do affect groups, and certainly they affect individuals. But the way that they are remembered, the way that they're remembered collectively, which is very different, of course, from how they're remembered by individual survivors, right? I mean, the way they're remembered by different, for example, aspects of the same, say, ethno-national group. I mean, if you think about, for example, the Ukrainians or the Armenians as a transnation, I mean, in the Armenian case, for example, it has been quite different in terms of the ways that the Armenians in diaspora have thought about the possibilities, right, that are tied to the recognition initiative, including the relationship with Turkey, as opposed to how certain actors inside Armenia proper think about this. And of course, it's very much shaped also by, let's say, geopolitical anxieties. The Armenians in Los Angeles are not affected by the relationship with Turkey the same way that Armenians in Armenia are. So there are many different factors. So I think in many ways, it's chosen trauma, chosen victimhood. In the case of Bosnia too, I mean, I could, give you examples as well, that it certainly becomes, and in Bosnia is an interesting case because it's almost, the mirror images. So that for the Serbs and the Croats, I mean, they've sort of become a bit of experts in this because they've had a longer nation building project. And so, choosing the respective historical victimizations, whether it's 1389 for the Serbs, the famous or the infamous Kosovo battle and things like that. The Bosnian Muslims have come to the nation building project historically a little later. But in terms of, and again, it's almost a mirror image in terms of what kind of strategies are being employed by the nationalists and by the nationalist, for example, parties that engage in nation building. And so, choosing these kinds of historical events. Now, to answer your question about literature, so the question was whether the literature, the philosophical literature sort of looks, does philosophical literature look at genocide from the perspective of good and evil. I'm not so familiar with the philosophical literature per se. I just am not. I do know, however, that, one of the very famous pieces, I think, that most of us who research or teach on this subject look, of course, at Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil. I think that's probably one of the most cited and certainly the most influential pieces. The psychologists and the psychiatrists have certainly looked into this, the Stanford prison experiments, for example. I think the really interesting thing about the Stanford prison experiments, of course, is that it's contextual, right? And so that it's I think beyond good and evil that certain contexts will produce, in fact, predictable results because the repeat of Stanford was the Stanford that was repeated. I think the repeat of Stanford gave us exactly the same results many decades later, sort of, so that it's the context that produces certain behavior that are then conducive to genocides on a larger scale.
You're talking about the Milgram.
Yes, thank you. That was the other sets of experiments. Yes.
Which one?
Milgram experiment. Milgram.
Stanley Milgram.
Yes.
1960 or something like that.
He was 63, I think.
Okay.
And Zimbardo is what you're thinking.
Zimbardo with a Stanford? Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Can you talk about the extent to which and the conditions under which there's remorse expressed? I mean, I often hear that people compare Japan to Germany, that the Germans recognize their bad history and made a big story of it and tried to make sure it never happened again and went through a whole process. And that Japan, well, let's see, I think of it with respect to the rape of Nanking, for example, that atrocity was is still being denied.
Yes.
And people, for example, my friend Joy Kogawa is always in trouble with people because she keeps telling the Japanese that they really need to deal with that. And they don't like it. And it's still an ongoing issue every day of the week for her. But sometimes it seems that this acceptance or repentance may come and go. I think what's happening now in Poland, where all of a sudden they've passed a new law saying you're not allowed to say that Poles were anti-Semitic.
You're not allowed to say Polish concentration camps because they were Nazi concentration camps.
All right. Okay. Right. Okay. So what accounts for? Is there any theory as to when people will repent and when do they deny?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question. So I'll try to give a couple of examples. I'll start with Germany because simply because Germany is the case that's often cited as sort of this great success. So Germany is a state that, ushered in the era of World War II and the annihilation of I don't know how many millions of people from Europe and things like that. So Germany is considered to be the state that has come to terms with its own history. So all of this is reflected in its, for example, the commemoration of the Holocaust in the way that the Holocaust is taught in German schools. What's often cited, of course, is the apology. Oh God, help me with the name of the politician who kneeled.
Willy Brandt.
Yes, thank you. So, what that embodies, the fact that actually Germany paid compensation to the state of Israel, and I can comment some, about some of the details of that. And so, Germany is then seen as an example to be followed. But I think it's problematic. And I'll tell you what I think it's problematic with respect to some of the cases in which the German example is sort of taken and said, well, let's just, if we could only do this, then, we could fix Bosnia, or if we could only do this, we could, fix maybe Japan. One of the things I think about Germany, and again, so this is, Germany does not apply. I think that the case of Germany does not apply to instances of interethnic conflict in which groups following violence have to live together. Doesn't apply to Bosnia, doesn't apply to Rwanda, won't apply to Iraq, and here's why. Germany, even before the Holocaust, had only about, what was the Jewish population? 1% of the entire population. By the time the Holocaust started, half of that left. So half of the 1% of the Jewish population has already left Germany in the 1930s, and what was left, I'm talking about the Germany proper before it sort of invaded the rest. And so very small Jewish population. So in terms of the interethnic relation, after the war, even if all of those Jews wanted to go back to Germany, it really would not, perhaps, but I think it would not mean much. They would be drowned into sort of, the sea of Germans. So a small number of people, you can just think about daily interactions, the possibility that whatever the returning Jews will see the henchmen of Auschwitz and stuff like that, stuff that happens daily or used to happen daily in the 1990s and throughout, early 2000 in Bosnia, where people would return to their homes and see people who kill their families or, rape their families. Same thing with Rwanda. So Germany does not work in this particular context where the victimized group and the perpetrator have to live together following the actual conflict. The other thing that had to do a lot with, let's call it the German success, well, it was American boots on the ground, and it had to do a lot with what was imposed upon Germany. And even what was imposed upon Germany, I think, is often misunderstood. And we know that it's often misunderstood because it was that misunderstood notion that was applied to Iraq with disastrous consequences. So denazification. Well, what does that mean? So it meant that they took out the top Nazi leaders. They did not, take all the bureaucrats and all the people who were actually quite actively implicated in the killing machinery. They simply couldn't, because that would, be the end of the German state as we know it, and that did not happen. So even the Nazification was actually quite limited. So it was much more, in terms of sort of discourse. But it's what came, what was imposed from the outside. So I think, those are the two conditions. The imposition is the one that was, for example, missing in Japan. The Americans did not stay in Japan as long, and certainly the kind of processes that happened as a sort of part of the post-World War II state building in Japan under the context of MacArthur administration certainly was not of the sort. I think the actual victimization of Japanese themselves, the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki, these moments were also very important. I think that sort of in the collective mindset, it was, well, this is what you've done to us, now just leave us alone. I think it's very simplistic, but I think that too, that competes, with non-king in sort of in that mind. But I think it's really sort of these early years of reconstruction of both Germany and Japan of how different they were that I think accounts for and why there can be lessons learned, I think, from each of these cases, for example, for, I don't know, Iraq or not. But these have to be very selective and very carefully applied because they're simply not universal and they cannot be used in all contexts.
Okay, can I go with that
Yes.
a little bit more and talk about, say, the Japanese in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese in Canada are not exactly the same situation as the Japanese in Japan with respect to these pressures. But as I understand it, the Japanese in Canada are also very reluctant to acknowledge any culpability of Japan for some of the things, bad things of World War II. Can compare that to something like what's going on now with let's say the Burmese in Canada watching what's going on with the Rohingya.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that is, but I should know because I'm in touch. I could be in touch with those people.
Right.
I know them, but I haven't been following it. My sense is that they may also, most of the Koreans or some of the others that are in Canada now and came as refugees from Burma themselves, are reluctant to acknowledge the victimization of the Rohingya.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if that's true, and maybe somebody can correct me. Can you say anything about what it's like for people who identify with their homeland and but who don't live under the same political constraints?
Well, I mean, it's a wide range of reactions. I mean, you can, for example, think that, for example, the members of the Turkish diaspora, the Turks who live outside of the confines of Turkey, even, after they have, been to universities in the United States or Canada and have been exposed to evidence, for example, about events of the 1915, let's just call them that. There's certainly a resistance, and I think that, sometimes it's the resistance that's simply based on national pride. I mean, I think for most people, that's what it is. Sometimes people just don't care. I mean, it's I think it's simple as that. It could be that they have grown up or have been socialized in an educational system that has actually been very ideological. That could be the case. So I think it's a wide range of reactions. I think for the most part, I mean, I think, if I could make an observation is that for the most part, I mean, and again, a generalization of how a group A reacts to events in the homeland or how group B, but for the most part, there is a bit of a closing of ranks. And I think it has to do with, with national identity and what potentially a recognition that, my homeland is doing that to that particular group. I mean, what that does to a person or to a group. So, I mean, I think it can go from, being completely indifferent on a certain scale to denying it or Ukrainians, it would be regional, it would depend on ideological affiliations and, things like that. So I think it's a wide range of responses that we can and should expect from different diasporic groups. Okay.
How are we supposed to react given the recognition of the Sikh atrocities when, as I understand it, the Sikh community, members of the Sikh community here were responsible for the Air India crash. There's an example of people in diaspora who have taken the battle to their new country and have exercised their view of that battle in a very dangerous and fatal way. How are we, as a host country, if I can use that term, I don't mean that in any other way except to explain myself, how do we react to that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. How do you react to that? Like, how do we react to that?
Well, we've got a minister of defense.
Well, no, I mean, so I think that, I think to me personally, it's a very complex issue. If I could just say my personal opinion, I think that I tend towards the view that parliaments are not healing institutions. And in my view, the only case of genocide that I think belongs in the discussion of the Canadian Parliament is that happened in this territory. But again, that's just my view. I mean, there are other individuals and certainly other collectivities that have a different view. And, the argument does not necessarily have to come from a nationalist position. It can be one of a liberal democracy, that violation of human rights anywhere in the world should concern us because we are a liberal democracy. So it doesn't have to come from a nationalist or, militarist position. So, I mean, I think that really, and, it is going to be something that will be part of the political discussion. I do think that this is a very interesting case politically, simply because, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to the two other cases, I'm not going to talk about Bosnia because it's geopolitically insignificant. But if you think about, Canadian recognition of the Armenian genocide or the Ukrainian genocide and angering two great powers, I mean, Turkey and Russia, right? So far, Canada hasn't suffered much because of that. We don't have a trade relationship with Turkey that's of any significance, or with Russia that's of any significance. So fine, we can go ahead and recognize these cases because it's dictated and shaped by domestic political concerns. And as we saw, with respect to, for example, the strength of the Ukrainian community over years, they're playing an increasingly important role, both in provincial politics and similar to the Sikh. I think the Sikh case is going to be something of a test case, because I think the cost-benefit analysis is going to be very different, simply because if not now, then there is a hope and I think a plan that India should become a very important economic partner of Canada. And that, I think, is going to be a big dilemma should this issue continue. I mean, for now, it has been a private member's bill in the provincial legislature. And I think this is also how both the Minister of Defense, but I think also during the debate surrounding the recent visit by the Prime Minister, that this is also, we're a democratic state. This is a subnational. This is a provincial legislature. Is not a federal legislature. We don't control what goes on, therefore, and so that's how it was presented, and that's how it is. Should this become an issue in the Parliament in Ottawa, then I think it is going to be somewhat of a test case, because again, the cost-benefit analysis would be different. I mean, what would it do to Canadian relationship with India, if anything, considering also that who is currently in power in India is a Hindu nationalist government. So, on that side as well, it would have a different meaning than if there was somebody else in power. So I think that it is a bit of a test case, and it's not straightforward. Online questions, and then I'll go back.
Actually, it's from me.
Yes. Well, both online and in person.
Yes. So I was wondering, you had briefly mentioned genocide of the Indigenous peoples in Canada and North America. Could you speak about that and the steps that are being made for reconciliation?
Well,
and is it an act of remembering and healing, or are there different ways that we could be going about it?
I think, well, to me personally, it's actually a very difficult case to speak about, because it becomes just very emotional. I mean, I think there's so much more that needs to be done and that can and should be done. And, the question is, I think that one thing that's very much missing is the actual active voices of the indigenous peoples. I mean, I know that, we've had this whole process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and certainly this is where the voices came in. But again, this has been largely focused on, residential schools and dealing with that particular instance, both in terms of the trauma, because we still have survivors, individual survivors who have gone through that. But I think the issues, the real restorative justice questions, I think, are going to be very difficult because they do involve resources. I mean, I think it's incredibly, it's unacceptable that, Indigenous children need to go to federal court, to the Supreme Court of Canada to get their rights or, to get equal funding for education and health services in a country like our own, right? So I think that when it comes to these concrete steps, there is a lot of discourse and rhetoric, but when it comes to the actual restorative justice that takes the form of financial compensation and certainly benefiting from land rights, that is something that I'm just not very hopeful at the moment. But I think that is really the crux. Gestures and symbolic, apologies, all of that is part of this process, part of the conversation. But I think that the real willingness, and of course the challenge here is that, not selling the idea, but I guess selling the idea to the general Canadian public, most of which I think, if you think about many of the newcomers, they simply don't even know about this long history and what the implications of sort of centuries, if you wish, of marginalization and this legacy is for the Indigenous population. So substantive steps as opposed to, or rather in addition to, the symbolic apologies and recognition. I think that's what's key. Okay.
There may be cases where it's noble or worthwhile for one country to speak out about injustices in another country, but it's also treacherous water. I'm thinking to your comments in terms of the trouble that Trudeau got into in his trip in India, kind of almost being photobombed as he was, and the NDP leader for previous statements made, I think it was in California a number of years ago, that came back. It's just amazing how something said somewhere at I think it was at a university, a decade or more ago, could surface.
Well, that's the joys and perils of the politics of multiculturalism. And it's something that. It's not, multiculturalism, of course, is not all about, funding Sunday school for Ukrainians or, I don't know, whatever school or whatever else it may be. It's also dealing with these, with historical baggage of groups that make it, part of their politics in their host societies. And if you think about Canada and the United States, the political systems are such that actually, I think politics can pay off to the groups that actually want to see some of these issues. So, in the United States, for example, in states where you have concentration of certain ethnic groups, in Canada too, in the prairies, right? So you can see that, this certainly becomes an issue domestically. It also becomes an issue in terms of the foreign policy. And again, there are some really tough decisions that need to be made in terms of, sort of thinking, it's almost like, the veil of ignorance, because it might be okay for now, because we're now thinking, well, okay, so we don't like Russians much. We don't like Putin, right? And so, sticking it to Putin by recognizing the Ukrainian genocide, or even you can sort of extend the argument, right? And, the Ukrainians are, but it could be groups whose demands could actually challenge some of the longstanding alliances to the detriment And, how do we deal with that? I mean, I don't know. But again, that's why I think, the Sikh case is an interesting one because it's a very different calculus. I think that the federal state will have to deal with should this become an issue in the federal parliament or, for the prime minister of the day, should the recognition become an issue one day.
It also opens the can of worms of who in the community whose argument do you listen to? Often there's competing arguments. The Jewish community,
Yes.
for instance, it's just in the city of Toronto, the attitudes have evolved over the last number of years. Maybe I would say there's more polarization now than there was maybe 40 years ago.
Okay.
I think.
You could say so.
I think so, from observation. And it just, when it comes to dealing with really thorny, touchy issues, I think it's really difficult, treacherous territory again for politicians and governments.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
The two different prime ministers had two different reactions to the apology and compensation for the Japanese Canadians. Mulroney actually was positive and did acknowledge and compensate, but Trudeau argued against it. And I forgot on what grounds. Do you remember?
I don't know. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. Okay.
What do you think of this concept of cultural genocide?
Well, so cultural genocide is a cop-out. Like it's just qualifying it, and I'm assuming you mean because this is the term that the Canadian government uses with respect to the Indigenous people, or do you mean like generally? Okay.
In particular, I'm thinking about it in public discourse.
Okay. Well, I think for the most part, it's just a way of actually not saying genocide because it makes it somewhat, less. Cultural genocide almost sounds like a softer form, so it's not as bad as just genocide. And I think that in the Canadian context, I think the government has been very careful to actually use the word cultural genocide because of this. I think, well, first of all, the notion that which convention then does apply, and so in terms of legal and juridical aspect of it. But it doesn't really mean much because part of the genocidal destruction or actually at the heart of it is the destruction of the culture. So to call something cultural genocide as opposed to physical genocide, because one is, you're killing individuals and the other ones, you're killing their culture. I think that is just ways of trying to qualify something because it sounds less serious. And potentially sort of has different, lesser implications.
I would have assumed that it was lesser. I kind of think, when I've heard people use the word, it's often used as a way of saying that people are being assimilated.
Okay.
And they're losing their identity. They stop speaking their native language at home and things like that, and that this is a terrible thing that's happening to them, and it's sometimes called cultural genocide. And so I think that the term is often used as an extreme form of
Sure.
blame for something that is really nothing comparable to actual murder.
Absolutely. Well, it's the American right using the term genocide to describe what they call the epidemic of abortion. Okay, so
Sorry?
the epidemic of abortion.
Right. Okay.
So it's I think it's a bit of a misuse, and I think that ultimately then if everything is genocide, then nothing is. Although, of course, when you talk about cultural assimilation, there's always a fine line in terms of, is it assimilation that is chosen, or is it assimilation that is imposed, and things like that. But I think that, mixing up the word genocide in it is quite problematic. When governments use it, I think they use it very purposefully, especially if they're talking about the cases for which they could be responsible under the Genocide Convention, because the Genocide Convention does not talk about cultural genocide. So if it's a cultural genocide, well, then, it's fine. It's horrible, but it's not the actual genocide. So, we'll get by. But I think that, using it, almost casually to describe the loss of identity that comes out of, generations of living in not living in a homeland or, things like that. I think that's, it's problematic. And I think it takes away from the actual concept for which it was intended. Okay. Okay, so then the last question, or go ahead. Yes, please. You, sir.
Might it be possible to say something in terms of thinking about the possibility of trying to prevent genocide? It might be possible maybe to say something about the this the apparently disadvantaged principle of responsibility to protect. I mean, you're familiar with that. Probably.
Yes.
Didn't seem to to accomplish much, but
no. So I don't think that we need more terms. We don't need more resolutions. I don't think we need more, working groups on, state sovereignty or the responsibility to protect or what it may be, because the international law as it came into existence after World War II, including, of course, the Genocide Convention, gives us enough tools to essentially prevent genocides, to stop genocides, to act upon, getting justice in the aftermath. So I think the problem is not the lack of legal tools. I mean, international legal tools. The problem is the one of the unwillingness to intervene in these cases. And I think perhaps an even bigger problem is the fact that oftentimes the interventions happen on the pretext of the responsibility to protect. So you get interventions in cases that maybe do not necessarily warrant intervention, while at the same time cases that do not. And so then it does become about different kinds of motives for intervention. But I think that, we do have enough legal tools to enable states to prevent or stop genocides that are occurring. It's just that states choose not to do so.
right.
And on that hopeful note, we'll end, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next week, our speaker is Elizabeth Renzetti, who is a columnist at the Globe and Mail. I'm not quite sure what she's going to talk about next week. She has a new book out, and it's a kind of a feminist, sort of fun. She told me it was Irma Bombeck meets Mary Wollstonecraft or something like that. Some combination of feminist fun and games with maybe who is it? I can't think of the horror story that goes with Mary Wollstonecraft. Anyway, thank you for coming. And if you take some magazines, we usually go for supper afterward, those of us who want to, over at the Peanut Pub. Did you say you have to go home?
I'm sorry. I have 4 kids waiting for me at home.
She's a mother of 4, so she has certain responsibilities, but we can talk about going over to the Peanut Pub for supper. And if you do want a certificate, please sign up here, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for coming.
Okay.